Hi everyone, I'm Damien. You may have picked up, I'm from Manchester. I'm aware that the rain is here. I'm sorry, okay? It wasn't arranged. So I want to start today with a nice family photo. This is me, my partner of 11 years, Sarah, and our dog Havoc at Crufts earlier this year. This is the second year that we've been there as competitors. So we won outright in our event last year as pre-beginners, and we ended up coming second this year. Now, against this backdrop, Sarah's been thinking about starting a dog training business for a while, and this seemed like a good opportunity to actually get that off the ground, given back-to-back Crufts. So that business is WolfieAndFriends. It's named after our first dog. He sadly passed away last year, unfortunately. And at this point, so we've got a company name, we've got a company logo, and Sarah's got about 2.5, 3 years of dog training experience. But what we're missing is an online dog training platform to actually begin this business, advertise it around, and then scale it. So this is the calendar of what the point at the time of year these conversations are starting to happen. Crufts is a 4-day event, and this year it was at the start of March. And the first commit to what became the WolfieAndFriends repo was on the 26th of January. So that gives us 5 weeks between those two periods where we can actually make this happen. However, I have a day job, I've got a house to run, I have loads of other commitments going on. So actually we don't even really have 5 weeks at all. What I really have is a combination of lunches, evenings and weekends to actually get this working. So what we're going to go through in the next 30 or so minutes is what happened in those 5 weeks, how I went from an empty repo to an income generating web app. And that is my job, that's where I come in. So a little bit about me. This QR code is everything you need to know. This is blogs, this is socials, this is also a link to the session resources, so the slide decks here as well in a Git repo. So I'm an AWS consultant. I work for Steamhouse. We're an AWS advanced partner. I have no idea if we're hiring, so I'm not going to enter that mud fight whatsoever. So I've been there for 2 years, and then before that I've held various data roles going back over a decade. I'm also the leader of AWS User Group Lancashire, and I'm an AWS community builder in the data category. So let's get this off the ground. What are we actually going to need? Now, like every online business, we're going to need a domain, we're going to need a website and an email address. There's nothing really new here. This has been true for 20, 25 years at this point. Any e-commerce business needs those. So I sat down, me, Sarah, the dog, a few cups of tea, and decided on the features that we're going to commit to. So there's 3 within the 5 weeks. A contact page, because if people want to get in touch with Sarah but they don't have her email address, that's going to make it simple. Bookings platform for if people want to make use of Sarah's services for training their dogs. And a payments platform, because if people want to give us money, I don't want to have to make that hard for them. Just want to give something nice and quick. Now again, I only have 5 weeks for all this, so I need to find ways to either save time or to make that time work as effectively for me as possible. And there's 3 ways that I go about that. First was the idea of buying versus building. Now, as an engineer, as a consultant, my temptation is to build absolutely everything, but I don't have time. I've only got 5 weeks. So I went hunting for frameworks that I could use. It's usually a good place to start. A lot of problems you'll find usually have had some kind of input. And what I found, this tends to differ slightly by industry. There's no one set way to do it. The idea that I found that I liked the most was this. So the idea being that you would buy for speed. So this is if you want something done quickly, or if you've got a particularly gnarly problem that you need to solve. So payments is a prime example. So I used to work for a bank. There's a lot you have to think about when you're handling payments. Get someone else to do it if you can. Conversely, you would build for cost. Now with cost, you've got 2 aspects for this. There are a lot of SaaS providers out there already. The main one being websites, in the example I'm going to give, where they will give you whatever you need at short notice, but there is usually a significant cost. Squarespace, for example, they're asking £12 a month because they know they've got a good service, and they have. But if I go in bed with £12 a month straight away, WolfieAndFriends is immediately operating at a loss before we've got a single client. So there's that to consider. And besides this, there's other types of costs as well. So WordPress being a good example, a lot of the things they do are widgets, they're pre-designed, and they'll do exactly what they need to do. But if you want to go outside of that, it can then get quite restrictive. You end up usually having to code something yourself. It can get little, it can go a bit off the rails. And that's an opportunity cost, because then I'm having to fit in with what WordPress will let me do rather than what we actually want to do as a dog training service. So this is how that all landed. And you can see from the purchase columns, a lot of these, especially email, are solved problems. No one should be making their own email platform in 2026. It's just as simple as that. And with the other two, especially payments, as I've said, you've got vendors owning a lot of the risk. So they manage things like the CI/CD pipelines, like the project development, like the testing cycles. And if something goes wrong, I'm just submitting a ticket to them rather than panic after hours trying to figure out what's going on. And the other thing to bear in mind, none of these are key differentiators for a dog training company. No one's coming to WolfieAndFriends to marvel at our payment system. They just want their dog trained. On the other hand, the other column is precisely what differentiates WolfieAndFriends. So the website, the domain, the contact page, these are all cheap. They're all more customizable. They're all cheaper to implement and maintain than what's on the left. And this is how we're going to set WolfieAndFriends apart. So how are we going to build this? So the second time saver being infrastructure as code. I promise we're going to start talking about AI soon. I know where we are. We all know infrastructure as code as a well-known DevOps tool, but it is also a very good time saver. So the main aspects being you get to tell, in this case, AWS what you want, and they will just handle it for you. They will arrange the order, so the VPC before the EC2 instances, that kind of thing. They will make sure that happens in the appropriate order. You can also iterate quickly. So if I'm telling AWS I want a bunch of ECS containers or a bunch of Lambda functions, Python 3.14, whatever, if I want to change that, if I want to change the runtime or the CPU, the memory, I can just express that as numbers in the infrastructure as code library rather than having to go back into the console. And also this code is reusable. So I've got several side projects that already existed before this that code has gone straight into WolfieAndFriends from. And AWS have a number of patterns, such as the AWS Labs Git repo is the most prominent one, where they're pre-existing for a while. AWS have vetted them to make sure that they are structurally compliant, that they're within the well-architected framework. And also, increasingly, you're getting MCPs that are getting trained against this as well. So when I start making inquiries to Kiro, spoilers, it has that resource that it can use to be trained against. Two aspects of the infrastructure as code I'm using in this project. I'm using the CDK for the infrastructure, and I'm using Amplify for the website. Now, Amplify can be somewhat divisive, but its main benefit here is that it will do a lot of the back end for me. So it'll handle things like the CloudFront distribution, like the CDN. It'll handle things like the S3 buckets for the site assets, for the code. It also handles Shield, which I had no idea about until someone asked me about it last week. So it handles Shield for me as well, and I had no idea. But it's less that I'm having to express in my CDK. So it's a further time save there. And as I've mentioned, we've got AI services in the mix as well. So QDeveloper and Kiro have been used in WolfieAndFriends. And in previous versions of this talk that I've given, I have talked about QDeveloper. And then AWS pulled the plug on it. So you can no longer look at QDeveloper anymore. If you already have it, it's not going to stop working anytime soon, but you can't set up new accounts on it. So AWS is sunsetting that within the next 12 months. So I'm going to talk about Kiro instead. So Kiro, unlike QDeveloper, has its own IDE. The distinction between the two, QDeveloper exists as a plugin within VS Code, JetBrains, etc. Whereas Kiro has its own IDE, which is a fork of VS Code. Its main feature is the idea of spec-driven development. So rather than a synchronous back and forth with the model, you get to express what you want and it back and forth, which you'll see in a demo later on. It's generally a more thoughtful approach to what you're trying to make. If you do still want to use QDeveloper, it still kind of exists within Kiro. There is a vibe feature which enables the synchronous back and forth like you've seen with Claude, like you've seen with ChatGPT. So let's actually start getting into building some of this. So I'm going to start with the site and the content page, the contact page, because they're both fundamentally the same thing. This was a build decision in favour of AWS. I've already mentioned Squarespace wanted £12 out of the bat. That's on the more expensive end of the spectrum. There are ones that will hover around £6 or £4 as well. But again, you've still got the same issue. I immediately start with a negative balance for anything that WolfieAndFriends is going to use again. You know, we have to have customers to fill that balance up. Whereas with AWS, it's pay as you go, and most of this is serverless, as you'll see in a second. Oh, as you've seen now, never mind. It's also fully customizable, so if I can code it, then I can express it on the site. And again, there's the well-known serverless patterns that have been used for over a decade at this point. They've been tested by numerous enterprises, so they're okay for a dog training company with a few dozen users. And this is the architecture. So there's two accounts in here that exist within my personal AWS organization. You've got the one at the top, so this is a networking account. This only contains Route 53. So this is the DNS records for WolfieAndFriends. I've also got the blog lives here as well, a couple of other things, but all my Route 53 resources are in the same place because again, infrastructure as code, I don't want to be thinking about that, all in the same place. Then I've got the WolfieAndFriends production account. So two main aspects to this. I've got the Amplify deployment for my web app that we've spoken about before. And I've got my CDK resources that handle the contact page infrastructure. The Git repo contains both the Amplify and CDK resources, and then depending on the deploy instructions that I give, that influences the actions in GitHub, which influences what actually gets deployed. When a user interacts with the site, they go via Route 53 to the Amplify distribution in WolfieAndFriends production, and then they get served the content the same as any other website. When a user interacts with the contact page, the payload in the contact page gets passed via API gateway to the Lambda function. That Lambda has two jobs. So it will log what's happened in the DynamoDB table, mostly for auditing, mostly for GDPR, because we have to be able to prove we've spoken to a client with consent. It also interacts with SES. It then sends a message nicely formatted to the Zoho inbox, which is for WolfieAndFriends. So uses of AI in this project. First of all, by far the biggest time saver for me, I got it to do the entire Amplify side of things, because I've done a lot in my 10 plus years. I have never done web dev. I completely lost interest when I was doing it in H&D. I have no idea what I'm doing with it. By far the biggest time saver. It also gave me a test suite as well. So there's a number of validation aspects to the site which are in there as well. To a lesser extent, I also used it in the CDK. Now, when you spin up a new CDK deployment in a new account, there's a certain amount of boilerplate. So I got QDeveloper to help with that. And also a test suite for some of the resources, just checking things like, if I say there's 3 Lambda functions, make sure that there are actually 3 in the CDK outputs. Also, through reusing the code, it means I'm using less Kiro credits. So we'll talk about Kiro credits later on, but this is basically maximizing my utilization of Kiro services. I already had a Lambda that was doing a very similar job, but it didn't have any unit tests, so QDeveloper and Kiro did that for me. And also, as an extension of that, you can do code reviews. So got a code review going of the Lambda, just to make sure there's nothing there that was untoward. And continuing with that theme, there is an open source repo called pre-commit hooks, which is in the session resources. They do things like linting, like PEP8 checks, package security, everything like that. And because it's online, because it's freely available, Kiro knows how to do the config. So I got it to do the config for that. A bit of back and forth. QDeveloper is also enabled in GitHub, so any PRs that I do will be checked by QDeveloper prior to any merge into the main branch. So to quickly show what it looks like from the user's point of view, I mean, there's not much here that's earth-shattering. We've all seen contact pages before, but put some basic information in there. And one of the aspects that QDeveloper put in there for me, if you try and send something but you don't accept the privacy, then you simply won't be able to send the message. So there's an extra bit of validation there for us that we know that the user has had to go through that step. That message then triggers the API gateway, which goes through the process that you saw before. So now let's look at the bookings. This was a buy decision this time because booking platforms, they're not the hardest thing in the world to make, but I don't really want to own things like the testing, things like the UI. I kind of prefer for someone else to do that. So went looking at the providers, landed on Cal, which is not as well known as other providers like Calendly, but they all fundamentally do similar services. So they all exist as API-driven services, so similar to AWS. As long as you know which API calls you're making, as long as you know the endpoints, then it's just a case of interacting with the client. They have a very good free tier if ever you need that. WolfieAndFriends hasn't breached it in the 3 months we've been around so far. And they also have a very good React embed component, which you'll see in the next demo, which just slots straight in. And it's well documented. So when I threw this at Kiro, you'll see in the demo, it actually reads the documentation to understand things like the data schemas, things like what data actually needs to be exchanged back and forth and how to authenticate. This is what the architecture looks like. So when you sign up for an account, you get a bunch of endpoints, bunch of credentials. And because Cal by nature is a public booking system, most of these aren't particularly secure. So they aren't, don't get me wrong, they're not in the Git repo because they've got 10 plus years of not putting parameters in Git repos, but they do need to go and Amplify, so I've just used the AWS CLI to do that. It's a one-off process. And then forked the React component and integrated that into the WolfieAndFriends repo. And then when the user interacts with the booking page, they interact pretty much instantly with Cal. 2 demos this time. You're going to see what it looks like from the user point of view. And then I've recorded a like-for-like demo with what me and Kiro did to actually get this working on the back end so you can get a flavour of how Kiro actually went about it. So this is a slightly earlier version of the site, the user making a booking. You're going to see quite quickly, let's wait for the demo to catch up. So already we're interacting with Cal's embed component. So the URL is still WolfieAndFriends, but now this is entirely Cal's responsibility to maintain. We can do things like control servers availability. We can put meeting types in there. Can also influence what days of the week she is and isn't available, times, that kind of thing. And a user can also fully self-serve, so they can set up an appointment, cancel appointment, do whatever they need to do. So now, demo from the AI side of things. So a couple of things about this demo before we get started. The WolfieAndFriends repo itself is not currently publicly available for reasons that become apparent shortly. But the repo that accompanies this demo is, so it's in the session notes if anyone needs it. The repo coming in, coming in, the only thing it has is a small Amplify site which is empty, just to give Kiro something to work with. And there's a clock in the top right-hand corner, which you'll see speed up, slow down, but it's a real-time clock, so it shows you how long Kiro's taken to do all this. You're going to see 3 documents that Kiro creates. First of all, you get a requirements document, which is a summary of the project, glossary of key terms, and user stories and acceptance criteria. So any Jira fans, you're going to love this. Design document's the next one to get produced. So this is the goals of the project. And then we get a bit more technical at this level. So this is things like code samples, data models, integration patterns and architecture diagrams, all produced by Kiro. And then lastly, we get a task document, which is the implementation plan. So this is a per task checklist, and this is a living document that Kiro updates in real time. Now these are all fairly big. Again, these are in the repo that I've shared. And I would say you can also, much in a similar way to what you can do with Claude, so you can express rules on a Claude level, on a repo level, you can do all that with Kiro as well, and it will consider them when it's making these documents. So we'll begin the demo. So first thing we're going to do is just effectively show there's nothing up my sleeves, just show the current state of the site that Kiro's using. So yeah, it's nothing there at the moment, it's basically a blank slate. Now most of what Kiro is going to do is in the right hand side, so we've got the chat window, we're going to be expressing instructions. I'm going to swap it to spec-driven development and then give the prompt that's in the session notes to Kiro. The prompt is just saying I want to integrate a component for booking system into this site to produce unit tests and ask me if there's any questions. Kiro in response is then asking, well, tell me about this work. Are we doing a feature? Are we fixing something? How do you want to do this? Okay, so now the clock speeds up a little bit. Kiro's immediately going to ask me a bunch of questions because I've told it to. So this will just help refine the scope. So what we're going to start seeing now, Kiro's going to make some documents. Made a folder, just capture some basic config, and this is where it's going to create the design documentation and the associated stuff. Okay, so now we've got the requirements that Kiro's come up with. So this is things like the user stories, the acceptance criteria, everything that it's judged we need at this part of the process. Now, like you would with any set of requirements, it's important to check this. More so perhaps with Kiro than if you're doing it yourself, simply because this is the design brief that Kiro's going to use for the rest of the documents and the project as a whole. Not to say that you can't go back and change this, but every interaction uses credits, and just be aware that over time, if you are going back and forth, the more open you can be with Kiro, the more precise you can be, the less credits you're using. And we'll cover back to that later on. You can edit them in two ways. So everything you're seeing here is markdown. You can just edit these documents yourself and save them. Or you can interact with Kiro in the chat window and it'll make those changes for you. So it's entirely your discretion. So we're shortly going to tell Kiro it's okay to proceed with the next part of the process. So this is producing the design documentation. You're going to see Kiro do a bunch of web searches now. And it's looking at things like the NPM library. It's looking at the Cal documentation. So this goes back to Cal making Kiro, making use of its things like its MCPs, like its web searchability to actually go looking for this documentation. Because I didn't tell it where to find it, I just told it what to do. And then we made the decision over Cal, and Kiro's made the decision to then go looking at those documentation. So now we're getting a design document. Kiro's producing things like the code samples we spoke about before, data models, the integration patterns. This is all saved as well, so this can be checked into Git. It can be a permanent record, so you can go back, you can reuse the same spec for other projects if you need to. It's all fully portable. And what we have now is the task document that Kiro's produced. So I'm now going to start telling Kiro to actually do some work. So you're going to see there's a bunch of tasks here, a bunch of subtasks. Kiro's it's got two ways to tell us what it's actually doing. You can see there's an icon on the document itself saying what task it's working on, and also status updates in the chat window. So this initial task, all it's doing is just setting up the frameworks for the rest of the project. So this is preparing an empty test library and installing the libraries it's going to need, I should say. So we're not going to see anything earth-shattering here. And the last part of the demo is just going to be Kiro checking everything else for the next part of the project. You can see we're getting continual updates. It's expressing what it's doing. Okay, so now we've got a completed first task. Kiro's told us everything it's doing. It's ready to start task 2 if we wanted to. So on to the final part. Now, in previous versions of this talk, I have talked about payments at length. I have had to trim some of it to get it under 30 minutes. So I'll just say the purchase in the end landed on Stripe, because like cal.com, it's an API-driven service, which when you're talking about payments, the less complexity you're having to think about in general, the better. In terms of the implementation, it's very similar to the bookings platform in terms of how Kiro went back and forth. The architecture is more involved, but fundamentally it was a case of it looked at the documentation, figured out what APIs it needed, and then derived the infrastructure. There is a version of this talk where I cover this in more details. Again, that's in the session notes if anyone needs that, if anyone's interested. What I want to talk about instead is the current state of WolfieAndFriends. So just look into how much all this is costing, and then takeaways from the experience, just going back to if I was to take another time-sensitive project again, the kind of things I'd think about, how I would use AI in these projects. WolfieAndFriends is currently at 106 commits with almost 650 unit tests using 16 AWS services. In terms of costs, so this graph is the WolfieAndFriends production account. Amplify is the main cost because it's my deployments. And you can see, aside from storage, I've got a bunch of other services along the bottom. I'm not actually generating any cost from those services. They're all well within free tier, things like your DynamoDBs, your Lambdas, etc. No costs. There are costs that are not represented here from Route 53 because they're in a separate account. I pay 50 cents a month for the hosted zone, and I paid $9 per annum for the WolfieAndFriends domain. So under $1 a month, averaging out over the year. So AWS expenses are about $2 a month. Kiro does have a cost. It's not here simply because it's not an exclusive WolfieAndFriends cost. I have an AWS organization. Somehow it has 17 AWS accounts in it by now. Kiro's doing a lot of heavy lifting for me elsewhere, so it's not exclusively a WolfieAndFriends cost, which is why it's not here. There is another cost, so Stripe are taking 50p from us for every £20 session that we're booking through the platform. And because we have a Stripe cost, we are actually generating money. So this is a graph from March to May of this year. So far we've got one class, and Sarah is billing £60 a week most weeks, so it's £20 a week. We're getting 3 people most weeks. Bit of a lull in May, but it's a bank holiday, people holiday, you know, these things happen. And we're in the process of securing venues and insurances for other classes. Don't get me wrong, we're not paying the mortgage off with this anytime soon, but considering this costs $2 a month to run, and we're generating on average £200 a month. So from where we are at the moment, it's in a pretty good position. I do briefly want to talk about Kiro credits because it's not fair for me to not talk about Kiro costs at all, because the implication being it's nice, it's wonderful, well, So Kiro does meter its use, and it meters them in terms of cost. In terms of credits. So this is the Kiro cost currently as of this year, and you'll see various tiers. Draw your attention to the credits that you get per tier. So this is how Kiro meters itself. AWS being AWS, there is a suitably long description of what a credit does. I generally summarize it as the more work you're asking Kiro to do, and the longer that work takes, the more credits you'll use. So this is a list of all the models that Kiro currently has access to. And this is the rate at which they use credits. So this is a cost multiplier per unit of work. Now, Kiro defaults to auto. Auto basically means Kiro will look at your prompt. It'll derive what the best model is based on the work you've asked it to do. And it'll use that model to then do the work. So that's typically something within, usually picks Sonnet 4, 5, or 4, 6. Always translates to 1 credit per unit of work if you're not making that decision. As soon as you are making that decision, the preposition changes. So even if you're choosing Claude Sonnet 4.0, your cost multiplier now becomes 1.3 times instead of just 1. So it's not that your costs will go up because it's $20 a month, but your utilization will increase. If you start using the Opus models, your utilization effectively doubles, so it's just something to be aware of. Not saying don't use them, just saying be aware of how much you are actually using them. The trade-off is this is not a black box. So there's 2 ways to see what your current utilization is. When you're in the chat window, it shows what setting you currently have. And if you change that, it shows you what utilization you're going to use. And you can also see, so there's a status bar along the bottom of Kiro that updates periodically with how many credits you've used against your limit that month. And if you click it, it will update instantly. So let's draw things to a close then. What are the takeaways from all this? So if you've got a time-sensitive project, we want a reusable blueprint for the kind of things that we can just hand over and redo quickly. So before you do anything, make times for planning and don't rush the decisions. Rather take the time to make the decisions properly and then have less time to actually do it than rush an important decision. You're 3 weeks in and it's not fit for purpose or it's not going to be finished. Build the differentiators, buy everything else and record the decisions. And the good thing about Kiro is it writes brilliant ADRs. Brilliant documentation, brilliant ADRs. Huge time saver. I'm not a fan of writing ADRs at all. So that's a great one. It also has access to the context window as well. So it knows what decisions have been made and it will factor those into the ADRs when it's writing them. When you've made a decision, you've got a timeline in place, stick with it. You will be tempted to change. Even Kiro will suggest at times, oh, have you tried this? It's like, not being funny, mate, we don't have the time. I want to go to bed. Again, as we spoke about before, there's a lot of well-tested and proven services for delivery at scale. Things like infrastructure as code, DynamoDB, Lambda, they're well-tested. They'll let you move quickly. They'll let you move repeatably. And again, because you can reuse it, you're not having to ask Kiro to redo the work. So you can just give Kiro the code, it can read it, it's not having to redo it, credit utilization's lower. You can also use familiar managed tools to solve unfamiliar problems. So going back to my use of Amplify, I had no idea, well, I'd never done web dev in my life, but I know how Amplify works. So I can express what I want to Kiro. I understand what Kiro's doing with Amplify. So I might not understand the result, but I know how we've got there and I know how I can repeat it. And lastly, best way to build something reusable is to build something that's actually going to get used, build something that matters. So it's arguably easier to build something now than it ever has been. And if you've got the right ideas, the right people in the room, we're in a position now, for example, where I've started one business, the financials are healthy on it. I've had interest from other dog trainers who want to integrate parts of the Wolfie and Friends platform into their sites, which is why it's not public at the moment, because we're in discussions with people. And ultimately, I've been with Sarah for 11 years. She's put up with a lot of me, and I disappear to London, I disappear to Sheffield all the time. For me to actually build something that's helpful for her, you know, I've wanted to do this for years, so it's been a great personal development journey for me as well. So that's it from me. These are the links from before. If you've got any questions, by all means grab me, or you can hit me on LinkedIn or in my socials. So thanks very much, guys.